If my husband had just lied better, I might still believe my marriage was perfect. That thought didn't cross my mind until the night his phone told me a different story than he did. My name is Emily Carter, I'm 38 years old, and until recently I believed I had the kind of stable, predictable marriage people spend years trying to build. Daniel and I had been married for 11 years, living in a quiet suburb about 20 minutes outside Columbus, Ohio. We had the kind of routine that felt safe. Dinner around 6:30, a little television after, sometimes a late walk around the block when the weather was nice. Daniel worked as a project manager for a logistics company downtown, the kind of job that occasionally required late nights and last-minute deadlines. At least, that's what he always said. On a Tuesday evening in early October, the air outside had that crisp Midwestern chill that makes you reach for a sweater even inside the house. I was standing in our kitchen stirring a pot of tomato soup while the clock above the microwave clicked past 7:15 p.m. Daniel had texted me about an hour earlier. Running late tonight. Stuck at the office finishing a report. That message didn't surprise me. It had happened before. I set his bowl aside on the counter anyway, covering it with a plate the way I always did when he worked late. The house was quiet except for the hum of the refrigerator and the faint sound of a football game playing from the living room television. I wiped my hands on a dish towel and picked up my phone to check the weather forecast for the rest of the week. That's when a small notification slid across the top of my screen. It came from the location-sharing app Daniel and I had started using the previous summer when he took a long driving trip for work. We had both agreed it was practical, mostly for safety. I tapped the notification without thinking. His location loaded slowly for a moment, the little spinning icon turning on the map. Then the blue dot appeared. I frowned immediately, because Daniel wasn't downtown at his office building on East Broad Street where he said he was. His phone was showing up nearly 10 miles away on the north side of the city, somewhere I didn't recognize. I zoomed in closer, expecting the dot to jump back to the correct place once the signal refreshed. It didn't move. Instead it sat there, steady and certain, in the middle of a cluster of apartment buildings near a road called Riverside Drive. I remember standing in the kitchen with the spoon still in my hand, staring at my phone as if it might explain itself. Technology glitches, I told myself. GPS mistakes happen all the time. Signals bounce off buildings. Phones lose connection. There were a dozen logical explanations, and I tried to believe every single one of them in the span of about 30 seconds. Still, something about the way that blue dot stayed perfectly still made a quiet, uncomfortable feeling settle in my chest. Daniel said he was at the office. But his phone was somewhere else entirely. I stood in the kitchen for another minute staring at the tiny blue dot on my screen, waiting for it to move back toward downtown, waiting for it to correct itself the way technology usually does when it catches a weak signal. But it did not move at all. The map stayed locked on that same apartment complex near Riverside Drive as if the phone was quietly insisting that it knew exactly where Daniel was. I told myself again that it had to be a mistake. Phones are not perfect. Satellites drift. Signals bounce off tall buildings. I even refreshed the map twice just to prove my own theory right. Each time the screen reloaded slowly, and each time the same blue dot appeared in the same place. I set my phone down on the counter and tried to shake off the uneasy feeling creeping into my chest. After 11 years of marriage you learn to trust patterns, and Daniel working late at the office was a very normal pattern in our life. There was no reason to question it. At least that is what I kept repeating in my head while I walked over to the stove and stirred the soup again. The clock now read 7:32 in the evening. Outside the kitchen window the streetlights had just flickered on, casting long orange reflections across the quiet road in front of our house. I picked up my phone again, this time opening Daniel's message thread. His last text still sat there on the screen. Running late tonight. Stuck at the office finishing a report. I read it twice, noticing how ordinary it looked. Daniel had sent messages like that dozens of times over the years. Sometimes he would come home at 9. Sometimes closer to 10. It had never felt suspicious before. Still, that small blue dot on the map was not downtown. I zoomed the location in further until the street names became clear. Riverside Drive. Maple Terrace Apartments. I had never heard Daniel mention that area before. The place was nearly 20 minutes from his office building and in the complete opposite direction from our house. I tried to imagine a harmless explanation. Maybe a coworker lived there and he had stopped by to drop something off. Maybe his phone was sitting in someone else's car. Maybe the location services were simply wrong tonight. I wanted one of those explanations to feel convincing, but none of them fully settled the quiet tension building in my stomach. I locked my phone and set it face down on the counter, telling myself I was overthinking something that did not matter. Then, almost without realizing it, I flipped the phone back over and checked the map again. The blue dot had not moved even a single inch. It was still sitting inside that same apartment complex, calm and certain, as if it had been waiting for me to look at it again. I told myself to stop checking the map, but the strange feeling in my chest would not go away that night. I tried distracting myself with small things around the house. I washed the dishes from dinner, wiped the kitchen counter, and turned the television volume a little louder in the living room. Still, every few minutes my eyes drifted back toward the phone sitting on the kitchen counter as if it had suddenly become the most important object in the house. Around 8:15 in the evening I picked it up again. I told myself I was only checking the time. But my thumb opened the location app almost automatically. The map appeared again, and the blue dot was still there on Riverside Drive. Nearly an hour had passed since Daniel sent his message about being stuck at the office, and according to his phone he had not moved at all. That was the moment when the situation stopped feeling like a simple technology glitch. I sat down at the small kitchen table and studied the map more carefully. The location marker was centered over a building labeled Maple Terrace Apartments. I zoomed out slightly to understand the area better. It was a quiet residential block on the north side of the city, surrounded by a few restaurants, a gas station, and a grocery store about half a mile away. Nothing about the location connected to Daniel's job. His office was downtown in a tall brick building surrounded by other corporate offices and parking garages. This apartment complex was in the opposite direction. I opened our text conversation again and reread his message. Running late tonight. Stuck at the office finishing a report. The words suddenly felt heavier than they had earlier. Not because they sounded suspicious on their own, but because the map on my phone was calmly suggesting something else entirely. I leaned back in my chair and tried to think logically. Maybe Daniel had stepped out for a quick errand. Maybe a coworker lived in that building and he had stopped by to drop off documents for the report he mentioned. There were reasonable explanations if I looked hard enough. Yet none of them answered the one question that kept repeating quietly in my mind. Why would he say he was at the office if he was actually somewhere else? I checked the time again. 8:22 in the evening. If Daniel truly was downtown finishing work, the drive home would take about 20 minutes without heavy traffic. I imagined him walking through the front door sometime around 9 o'clock, loosening his tie, and telling me about a long evening at the office the way he always did. That scene had played out many times before in our marriage. But now there was this new detail sitting silently on my phone screen, a small glowing dot that refused to match the story he had given me. And for the first time since I had opened that notification, a quiet thought crossed my mind that I could not ignore. What if the phone was not wrong at all? I kept telling myself that the simplest explanation was probably the correct one, but the longer I stared at that unmoving blue dot on the map, the harder it became to believe my own reassurance. I closed the location app and set my phone down again, forcing myself to step away from the kitchen table. I walked into the living room and sat on the couch, pretending to watch the football game that was still playing quietly on the television. The commentators were talking about a fourth quarter comeback, but I could not focus on a single word they said. My mind kept drifting back to Riverside Drive and that apartment complex I had never heard Daniel mention before. I reminded myself that after 11 years of marriage you do not suddenly assume the worst because of one strange detail on a phone screen. Daniel had always been reliable. He paid the bills on time, showed up to family gatherings, and never gave me a reason to question where he was. That history should have been enough to silence the small voice of doubt growing in the back of my mind. Yet the doubt refused to disappear completely. Around 8:45 I checked my phone again. I told myself I was only curious to see if the location had corrected itself by now. But when the map opened, the blue dot still sat in exactly the same place inside Maple Terrace Apartments. Nearly 2 hours had passed since Daniel sent his message about staying late at the office, and according to the phone he had not moved once. I felt a slow, uncomfortable tension settle deeper into my chest. I tried to imagine the evening from his perspective. Maybe he finished work and drove somewhere else quickly without thinking to update me. Maybe he stopped to help a coworker with something personal. There were still reasonable possibilities if I forced myself to believe them. But a new question had quietly started forming in my mind, one that felt impossible to ignore now. If Daniel was truly just helping someone or running a quick errand, why had he not simply said that in his message? Why choose the office as the explanation if he was somewhere entirely different? I stood up and walked back into the kitchen again, pacing slowly across the tile floor. The house felt unusually quiet for a Tuesday night, almost like it was waiting with me. Outside the window a car passed down our street and the headlights briefly lit up the driveway before disappearing again. I glanced at the clock on the microwave. 8:53 in the evening. If Daniel left downtown right now he could still be home before 9:30. That thought should have reassured me, but instead it made me realize something else. If he truly had been working at the office this entire time, his phone location would have shown it. And the longer that blue dot stayed parked at that apartment complex, the more difficult it became to convince myself that this was just a harmless mistake. I told myself I was going to stop checking the map, but the truth was I had already started watching it the way someone watches a storm forming on the horizon. You know something might be coming, but you still hope it turns in another direction. Around 9:10 in the evening I opened the location app again. The blue dot finally moved. For the first time in nearly 2 hours the small marker shifted slightly, sliding out from the center of Maple Terrace Apartments and onto Riverside Drive. I leaned forward in my chair without even realizing it. The phone showed the dot moving slowly south, following the exact path a car would take if it were leaving that neighborhood. My heart started beating faster because now the map was doing something that felt very real. This was not a frozen signal anymore. Daniel's phone was traveling down the road, turning onto another street, and then merging onto the main highway that led back toward downtown Columbus. I watched the little blue arrow move mile after mile while the digital map quietly traced the route. The drive from that apartment complex to Daniel's office building should have taken about 15 minutes with light traffic. But instead of stopping downtown, the marker kept moving. It continued south past the office district, past the tall glass buildings and parking garages where Daniel claimed he had been working all evening. I felt a strange mix of confusion and dread as the phone kept traveling. If he had really been at the office finishing a report, his phone would already be there. Instead it was just now passing through that part of the city. I glanced at the clock on the microwave again. 9:26 in the evening. That meant when Daniel texted me earlier about staying late at the office, his phone had actually been sitting at Maple Terrace Apartments on the north side of town. I did not know what he had been doing there, and I did not yet have proof of anything serious, but the timeline no longer matched the story he had given me. I sat very still at the kitchen table watching the blue arrow continue moving across the map. The highway curved west toward our suburb, and eventually the marker followed it. At that moment I realized something else. Daniel was now driving home exactly as if he had just finished work downtown. When he walked through the front door tonight he would probably loosen his tie, drop his keys on the counter, and tell me he had been buried in paperwork all evening. The routine would look the same as every other late night we had experienced during our marriage. But now I knew something about the evening that he did not realize I had seen. His phone had spent nearly 2 hours at an apartment complex 20 minutes away from his office. And the quiet certainty of that small blue dot on my screen had started to plant a question in my mind that refused to disappear. By the time the blue arrow finally turned off the highway toward our neighborhood, I had already made a quiet decision without fully realizing it. I was not going to mention the map tonight. I needed to see what Daniel would say on his own. At 9:43 in the evening headlights swept across the living room window, and I heard the familiar sound of his car pulling into the driveway. My phone was still in my hand, but I quickly locked the screen and placed it face down on the kitchen counter. A moment later the front door opened and Daniel stepped inside, carrying the same black laptop bag he took to work every morning. He looked exactly the way he always did after a long day. His tie was slightly loosened, and he let out a tired sigh as he kicked off his shoes near the door. "Hey," he said casually as he walked into the kitchen. "Sorry I am so late tonight. Work has been crazy." The words were so ordinary that for a second I almost questioned whether the map earlier had really meant anything at all. I forced a small smile and asked if he wanted the soup I had saved for him. Daniel nodded and set his bag down on the counter while I reheated the bowl in the microwave. While the machine hummed quietly behind me, he started describing his evening the way he often did after staying late at the office. He said a report deadline had come up suddenly and the team needed to finish reviewing numbers before the end of the week. He mentioned spreadsheets, conference calls, and a manager who kept asking for revisions. I stood there listening carefully, noticing how smoothly the story flowed. If I had not watched his phone move across that map earlier, I probably would have believed every word without hesitation. When the microwave beeped, I handed him the bowl and he thanked me before sitting down at the kitchen table to eat. For a few minutes the conversation returned to normal things. He asked about my day. I mentioned that I had gone grocery shopping and started planning a weekend visit to my sister's house. From the outside everything about the evening looked like a typical night in our home. But inside my head a quiet clock had started ticking. I could not stop replaying the timeline I had seen on my phone. Daniel said he had been at the office since early evening. Yet his phone had remained parked at Maple Terrace Apartments for nearly 2 hours before driving downtown and then home. As he finished his soup and stood up to rinse the bowl in the sink, I realized something important. Whatever explanation existed for that location on Riverside Drive, Daniel had not chosen to share it with me tonight. And that meant if I wanted to understand the truth behind that blue dot on the map, I was going to have to start paying much closer attention to the details he thought I would never notice. The next morning felt strangely normal, and that was almost the most unsettling part. Daniel left for work around 7:30 the same way he always did, grabbing a travel mug of coffee and reminding me that he might have another long day at the office. I watched him back his car out of the driveway and disappear down our quiet street, and the moment his taillights vanished I felt the quiet tension from the night before return immediately. The house was silent again, but now the silence felt different. Instead of ignoring the feeling in my chest, I opened the location app on my phone once more. The blue dot was now moving steadily through morning traffic toward downtown Columbus. Everything about the map looked exactly the way it should on a normal workday. That was when I realized something important. If I wanted to understand what really happened the night before, I needed more than a single strange location on one evening. I needed to see whether that same place appeared again. I spent the morning going through my usual routine, but my mind kept returning to the map and the name Maple Terrace Apartments. Around lunchtime curiosity finally pushed me to open my laptop and search for the address online. The apartment complex appeared immediately. Several photos showed a row of modern 3-story buildings with small balconies and a parking lot surrounded by neatly trimmed trees. It looked like a quiet place where young professionals or graduate students might live. There was nothing dramatic or suspicious about it, which somehow made the mystery feel even more confusing. I studied the map of the neighborhood and realized it was about 10 miles from Daniel's office and roughly 15 miles from our house. Close enough to visit easily, but far enough away that there would be no reason for him to pass through that area by accident. I closed the laptop and leaned back in my chair, trying to calm the steady stream of questions forming in my mind. The simplest explanation would still be that Daniel had stopped by someone's apartment for a work-related reason. Maybe a coworker lived there. Maybe a client had needed something quickly. I repeated those possibilities quietly to myself as if saying them enough times might make them feel completely true. Yet the thought that lingered most strongly was the one I had tried to avoid since the previous night. If that location appeared again, if his phone returned to that same apartment complex another evening when he claimed to be at the office, then the pattern would become impossible to ignore. That afternoon I made another quiet decision. I was not going to confront Daniel yet. Instead I would simply watch and wait. Because if the map on my phone had told the truth once, there was a very real chance it would tell the truth again. For the next few days I tried to act as if nothing unusual had happened, But inside my mind a quiet sense of awareness had taken over. I did not obsess over the map every hour, but I found myself checking it more often than I wanted to admit. Each time Daniel said he was working late, I noticed the words a little more carefully than before. Wednesday passed without anything unusual. Daniel came home at a normal time and talked about routine meetings and upcoming deadlines. Thursday was the same. By Friday afternoon I almost convinced myself that the strange location earlier in the week had truly been an innocent explanation I simply did not understand yet. But that evening, just after 6:30, Daniel sent another message. "Running late again tonight. The office is a mess this week." I read the message slowly while standing in the kitchen, feeling that familiar tension return. Instead of replying right away, I quietly opened the location app on my phone. The map loaded for a moment. Then the blue dot appeared. My heart dropped the second I saw where it was. The marker was not downtown. It was sitting once again on Riverside Drive inside the same apartment complex I had studied earlier that week. Maple Terrace Apartments. I stared at the screen for several seconds, hoping I had opened the wrong location somehow. But there was no mistake. The address label appeared clearly beneath the map, and the blue dot was resting in exactly the same spot where it had been before. The feeling in my chest shifted from confusion to something much more certain. One strange evening could have been explained away. But 2 nights in the same place created something else entirely. It created a pattern. I slowly set the phone down on the counter and looked around the quiet kitchen, realizing that the simple explanation I had hoped for was starting to disappear. Daniel believed I thought he was working late at the office again tonight. Yet his phone had gone directly to that same apartment complex instead. I walked to the window and stared out at the empty street while my thoughts moved quickly through possibilities I had tried not to consider before. There could still be a work-related reason. Perhaps a coworker lived there. Perhaps a client needed help with something private. I repeated those ideas again, but they felt weaker. This time. Because if the situation was truly innocent, there would be no reason to hide the location behind the same story about staying late at the office. I glanced back down at my phone one more time. The blue dot had not moved. It remained perfectly still inside Maple Terrace Apartments, calm and patient, as if it had no idea how much doubt it was creating. And as I stood there in the quiet kitchen watching that tiny marker on the screen, I realized something had changed inside me. Earlier in the week I had only been curious. Now I needed to know the truth. That evening I did something I had never done before in 11 years of marriage. Instead of waiting at home and watching the map from my kitchen table, I picked up my car keys. The decision formed slowly but firmly in my mind as I stared at the blue dot resting inside Maple Terrace Apartments. If Daniel truly had a harmless explanation, then seeing the place for myself would only confirm it. But if something else was happening there, I knew that sitting at home imagining possibilities would not give me the truth. By 7:15 in the evening I was pulling out of our driveway. The sky was already fading into that soft dark blue that settles over Ohio in early autumn, and the streetlights had begun to glow along the main roads. My hands felt slightly tense on the steering wheel as I followed the directions from the same map that had been quietly revealing pieces of Daniel's evening all week. The drive took a little under 20 minutes. Traffic was light, and the highway carried me steadily toward the north side of the city. The closer I got to Riverside Drive, the more aware I became of how calm everything looked outside my car window. Restaurants were busy with families finishing dinner. A gas station sign flickered above the road. Nothing about the evening suggested that anything important was about to happen. Eventually I turned onto the street labeled Maple Terrace Drive and slowed down. The apartment complex looked exactly like the photos I had seen earlier online. 3-story buildings lined both sides of the quiet road, each one surrounded by small trees and neatly painted parking spaces. Porch lights glowed warmly on several balconies, and a few residents walked casually across the parking lot carrying grocery bags. It felt like an ordinary place where people lived normal lives. I drove slowly past the first building and then the second, trying not to draw attention to myself. My heart was beating faster now, not because I knew what I would find, but because I was getting closer to the answer. Then I saw it. Parked near the far end of the lot was a dark grey sedan that I recognized immediately. Daniel's car. The license plate confirmed it even before I could fully process the sight. For a moment I simply sat there in my car staring across the parking lot, feeling a quiet wave of realization settle over me. His vehicle was parked neatly between two other cars as if it belonged there. The engine was off. The windows were dark. I looked up toward the nearby building where several apartment lights were glowing behind closed curtains. Somewhere inside that building Daniel was spending his evening while telling me he was working late at the office. I did not get out of my car right away. Instead I remained parked across the lot, watching the silent row of windows and listening to the low hum of my own engine. Because in that moment, the small blue dot on my phone had turned into something real, something I could see with my own eyes, and the quiet questions that had followed me all week were finally beginning to take shape into a truth I could no longer ignore. I sat in my car across the parking lot for several minutes, trying to slow my breathing while staring at Daniel's sedan parked beneath one of the dim streetlights. The engine of my car hummed quietly, and the glow from the dashboard clock read 7:42 in the evening. Nothing around me looked dramatic or suspicious. A couple walked past holding grocery bags and disappeared into another building. Somewhere nearby a dog barked once and then went silent again. The entire apartment complex looked peaceful, the kind of place where neighbors probably waved to each other in the morning and watered small plants on their balconies. Yet my eyes kept returning to the same dark grey sedan that I knew better than any other car in the lot. Daniel's car was here, not downtown at his office where he believed I thought he was. I slowly turned off my engine so the sound would not draw attention, leaving only the quiet ticking of the cooling motor. From where I sat I could see the entrance to the building closest to his car. The door was lit by a soft yellow light and a short concrete walkway led from the parking spaces to the front steps. I watched that doorway carefully, not entirely sure what I expected to see. Minutes passed slowly. At first nothing happened except the occasional car driving by on Riverside Drive beyond the complex. Then around 8 o'clock the building door opened. A woman stepped outside holding a small set of keys in her hand. She looked to be in her mid-30s, dressed casually in a light sweater and dark jeans. I would not have paid any attention to her at all except for what happened next. A second figure followed her through the doorway. Daniel. The sight of him stepping out into the evening air made something inside my chest tighten immediately. He looked completely relaxed, not like someone who had just finished hours of stressful office work. He was smiling about something the woman had said as they walked down the short path toward the parking lot together. They stopped near the front of his car and continued talking for a moment. I could not hear their conversation from where I sat, but their body language was easy and familiar, the kind of comfortable interaction people have when they know each other well. The woman laughed softly at something he said and rested her hand briefly on his arm while they talked. That small gesture was enough to erase the last fragile explanation I had been holding on to all week. Daniel had not been at the office tonight. He had been here, spending time with someone he had never mentioned to me. After a minute or two he unlocked his car with the remote in his hand. The headlights flashed once across the parking lot, briefly illuminating the trees and the front wall of the building. The woman stepped back slightly while he opened the driver's door. Before getting inside, Daniel paused and said something else to her that made her smile again. Then he climbed into the car and started the engine. As his headlights swept across the lot and pointed toward the exit road, I realized that the quiet question that had been building in my mind all week had finally turned into a clear answer. For a moment I remained completely still in my car as Daniel's headlights moved slowly toward the exit of the parking lot. My hands were resting on the steering wheel, but I did not start the engine. I simply watched as his sedan rolled past the row of apartment buildings and disappeared onto Riverside Drive, heading in the direction of the highway that would eventually take him home. The woman remained standing near the walkway for a few seconds after he left, watching his car disappear before turning and walking calmly back inside the building. The door closed behind her, and just like that the parking lot returned to its quiet, ordinary rhythm. I sat there for another minute staring at the empty space where Daniel's car had been parked, letting the reality of what I had just seen settle into my mind. For nearly a week I had been searching for an innocent explanation for that location on the map. I had told myself it might be work-related, or a simple misunderstanding, or a coincidence that I did not yet understand. But seeing him walk out of that building with someone else had quietly ended all of those possibilities. There had been nothing professional about the relaxed way they spoke to each other or the comfortable familiarity in their conversation. It was the kind of interaction people have when they spend time together regularly. Eventually I started my own car and pulled slowly out of the parking space, leaving Maple Terrace Apartments behind me. The drive home felt strangely calm, almost as if my mind had moved past shock and into a quiet state of clarity. The highway lights stretched out ahead of me while the city traffic moved steadily in both directions. I realized that by the time Daniel walked through our front door later tonight, he would probably tell the same story he had told earlier in the week. He would talk about long meetings and unfinished reports and the pressure of deadlines at the office. The difference now was that I had seen something he did not know I had witnessed. When I arrived back at our house, the driveway was still empty, which meant I had arrived before him. I stepped inside and turned on the kitchen light, placing my car keys gently on the counter. The house looked exactly the same as it had earlier that evening, quiet and familiar. But the way I felt standing inside it had changed completely. A few minutes later I heard the distant sound of a car approaching outside. Headlights swept briefly across the living room window before the engine shut off in the driveway. Daniel's footsteps moved toward the front door, and I realized that the moment I had been quietly preparing for all week had finally arrived. This time, when he stepped inside and repeated the same explanation about being late at the office, I would already know the truth behind it. I stood in the kitchen when Daniel opened the front door, hearing the familiar sound of his footsteps crossing the entryway floor. For a brief second I studied his face as he walked in, wondering if there was any sign that he realized I had been somewhere unexpected that evening. But he looked completely normal, just slightly tired the way he often did after a long day. He loosened his tie as he stepped into the kitchen and set his laptop bag on the counter. "Sorry I am late again," he said with a small sigh. "It has been a crazy week at the office." For the first time since this whole situation began, I did not feel the urge to question him immediately. Instead I simply looked at him and nodded once, letting the silence stretch for a moment. Then I asked a simple question. "How long were you at the office tonight?" Daniel shrugged slightly and reached for a glass from the cabinet. "Most of the evening," he replied casually. "We had to finish reviewing numbers before Monday." The explanation came smoothly, just like the other nights he had described working late. I waited until he turned toward the sink before I picked up my phone from the counter. When he faced me again, I gently placed the screen on the table between us. The location app was already open. A small map filled the display, and the blue dot rested clearly on Riverside Drive at Maple Terrace Apartments earlier that evening. Daniel's eyes dropped toward the phone, and for the first time since he walked in the door, the relaxed confidence in his expression shifted. I did not raise my voice or accuse him of anything dramatic. I simply spoke quietly. "You told me you were at the office tonight," I said. "The map says you were somewhere else." The room stayed silent for several seconds. Daniel stared at the screen, then slowly looked back up at me. In that moment I could see that he understood exactly what the map showed. The truth had already revealed itself long before this conversation began. I had seen his car parked outside that building. I had watched him walk out the door with someone he clearly knew well. The small blue dot on my phone had simply been the first clue. What mattered now was not the explanation he might try to offer. What mattered was the quiet clarity that had settled in my mind during the drive home from that apartment complex. For nearly 11 years I believed trust meant accepting every explanation without question. But sometimes the truth does not arrive through arguments or dramatic confrontations. Sometimes it appears quietly, in the form of a tiny signal on a phone screen that refuses to match the story you are being told. I looked at Daniel one more time, calm and steady, and realized something important. The map had not just revealed where he had been spending his evenings. It had also shown me exactly where I needed to go next with my own life.